Welcome to the We Fucking Love Startups podcast. I'm your host, Troy Hammond, and on today's episode, we chat with Owen Evans. Owen is the CTO at Timely and one of the great technology leaders that I know. On today's episode, we talk with Owen about attempts and the startups that he's been with, and Owen is actually the king of attempts, as you'll see. Enjoy.
Kia ora. Thanks for tuning into the We Fucking Love Startups podcast, brought to you by Talent Army.
So what do you do? Because like every great tech person has some creative element that they do.
Do we? I don't know. My creativity is Dungeons and Dragons, if you can believe that. So,
and you brew beer, right?
I brew beer. Yeah. Which is creative in a different Zen kind of sense, you know, like you create the recipe and then you spend 5 hours brewing 50 litres of beer.
Yeah. And do you iterate on it?
I try and make the same recipe multiple times because the trick with beer is consistency. Like if you can make the same beer and it tastes right, then you've got a good process.
And you do it all from home? Or do you?
Yeah. So I've got a 50 litre brew kit that I inherited off a tech colleague friend. So Duncan, who used to be the head of platform at Xero.
Yeah, Duncan Ritchie.
Yeah. So he was moving over to the Wire Wrapper and said, "Hey, I've got a 50 litre brew kit. Would you like it?" And I said, "Yeah,
cheers.
Please." So it's got all the burners and pumps and everything else, and then into a big.
Did you know anything about brewing beer before you started?
Now, my brother was a big brewer. He was living in Sydney at the time, and for my birthday, it would have been 10 years ago, sent me a kit. And it was pretty much like a plastic fermenter with grains that weren't ground at that time. And I was like, well, what am I going to do for grinding these grains? Because apparently you have to grind them, don't know. And looked up online, and Keru was brewing out of his house around the corner from me. Yeah. And so he said, yeah, come on down, I'll grind them for you. And I went down to his basement, and he had all this kit set up, and I went, wow. Brewed that beer. It was a wheat beer. I'm not a big fan of wheat beers, but it turned out really nicely. And I went, I'll keep doing this, and slowly progressed up from bigger kits to bigger kits to bigger kits. Yeah.
Nice. I've got 2 New Year's resolutions. I'll ask you what yours is after this. Number one of mine is to say yes this year. Mm-hmm. So just anytime I'm offered something or asked to do something, say yes, which has proven to be quite scary already. And number two is I want to get into...
Nobody's proposed to you yet?
No. But like I've eaten some weird stuff and done like the Melbourne, when I was in Melbourne over Christmas, the riverbed that we were staying in, everyone kept saying, oh, look, because of the flooding, it's really not swimmable at the moment. It's polluted and there's probably some sewerage in there, so don't swim. And my son was like, hey, Dad, what's your New Year's resolution? I was like, I'm going to say yes. And he goes, I dare you to jump in that river. And I was like, oh, dear. So I jumped in and then had a very quick shower. Yeah. But the second thing is I want to get into gin making. And so, that's the thing. What's your New Year's resolution?
I don't do New Year's resolutions. I don't kind of believe in them so much because, what's that arbitrary point in time? Yeah. But certainly this year is a little bit of focus on what do I want to do next, like trying to build the next thing for myself or where I want to go. Like not to say that, want to move on or anything like that, but just always thinking about the next 5 years, 10 years plan. So that's
a good thing to do as a recruiter. I highly recommend it. It's, it's always good to think about what's next and don't get stagnant, because that's when, I most of the time I interview people that are looking for a new job. It's just because they're a little bit bored or complacent and they haven't started planning even what their current role is next, let alone, what their next opportunity is.
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of ways that my career can go, my life can go. You all know, nobody saw the pandemic until the pandemic happened, and then it's like, oh, okay, cool, rethink everything. So you've always got to be open to like change and things changing under you. And
we're not allowed to say that word because we keep getting little notifications on our Spotify.
Okay, cool. Yeah. It is real. Please vaccinate everything else.
Yeah. Awesome. So let's go back a bit. Obviously, your accent isn't so Kiwi.
No, I'm British. I was born in 1982 in Newcastle upon Tyne, and then moved. My dad was a doctor, and back in the 80s, the way that you trained as a doctor is you did lots of stints at different hospitals around the country, essentially. Yeah. So he'd all of myself and my two brothers were all born in different cities around the UK. He moved from Newcastle then to Cardiff, which is where I grew up, essentially. That was a consultancy opportunity.
I thought you were Welsh, and I was surprised when you said English there.
Yeah. So I'm technically Waiaiman, I'm a Geordie, but then grew up in Wales. But I don't really have a Welsh accent. I come from a place called Penarth, which is just outside Cardiff. And if you know any Welsh people who are in the south of Wales, they call it the posh end. Oh, yeah. So do speak with a bit of an Anglified accent.
Nice.
Yeah.
I've been watching that Ryan Reynolds documentary about the team.
Wrexham.
So good.
Yeah,
so good.
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, I love embracing the Welshness that I have. You know, like my grandparents are Welsh, and my father was born in Swansea, so I am Welsh by genetics. But certainly growing up there and coming to New Zealand in 2007 when I did, and seeing the resurgence of Te Reo and everything else has been like, there's a lot of parallels there to that culture. So,
I think it's really good. I as I said, I just came back from Melbourne for Christmas, and the difference between Australian and Indigenous Australians versus Indigenous New Zealanders, they're only just starting Australia on that journey now about, oh, holy shit, we've been assholes. You know, we should be, should be think about what we're doing now. And so it was actually really cool to go home and see that they were looking at New Zealand as that's how we should be doing it. And I think we can still do it better here, but, you know.
Yeah. I mean, it's just interesting when you think about language and culture and how just weird processes can affect a culture. You know, like in Welsh, you know, Welsh wasn't an official language until the 1980s. You know, to run Wales, you couldn't really publish anything in Welsh. It wasn't done. It was all English first. That's transformed now. You go into Wales, everything is bilingual. Everything has to be bilingual legally. And that's just a resurgence of people understanding what Welsh was and why it existed. It's a very, you know, creative language. Lots of poetry and music has been written in Welsh over the eons. You know.
Do you know the name of that long town?
Llampau Pwthgwyn Goch yn Gerll Llandowath Llansilio Gogogoch.
Holy shit! Yeah, okay,
that
you
one.
do. Yeah, you do. So, what was it like growing up in Wales? And
so I'm not going to deny I was, white, privileged, middle class. So I didn't experience the worst of Wales. You know, if you go to the valleys and you go to
you're in the posh part, right?
Yeah, pretty much. If you go to the coal mining areas, which was decimated by the Thatcherite era of shutting down coal mines, it was incredibly poverty-stricken. I lived in a relatively well-to-do, you know, multi-story house that was rather large for my area. So, you know, I didn't experience the hardship that Welsh people have. Certainly saw it around. It's quite a vibrant culture. Cardiff is great, you know, like rugby was my dad's passion. He's got seats at the Cardiff Arms Park and the Millennium Stadium. You know, we used to go and watch Wales play all the time. Loved. There's nothing quite like being in Cardiff Stadium when the rugby's on, like all of the songs that sing around there. And just used to, you know, live by the sea, so I could go sailing when I wanted to. I taught sailing for a long time.
Do you still sail now?
I haven't sailed for about a decade, which is quite embarrassing. But I used to teach sailing. Like at a university, I went and did 6 months in Greece and taught sailing, and you know, I've done France and taught sailing. It was a door opener for me for quite a while, but it's just a great sport. Like, I seem to gravitate towards solo sports, so I've never been a team sport person myself. You know, I like watching rugby, but I'd never play it. But I do, you know, I ski, I sail, I play golf. You know, those kind of things that are quite solo. It's like, I don't know, maybe it's just about me really caring about how well I do and not really wanting to rely on other people.
Being a perfectionist?
Yeah, maybe. I like to think I'm a pragmatist, not a perfectionist, but maybe I just really want to get better at myself. And I remember playing rugby as a schoolboy, and I was easily one of the worst players on the team, and just the embarrassment that you're letting a whole side down.
Yeah, and especially if your dad's a super fan.
Yeah. And it was just like, oh, I just can't put up with this pressure of like being the worst player.
Yeah. Who do you support in the rugby then?
So, you know, I'm in Wellington, so you've got to support the Hurricanes. Yeah. I will support Wales and anybody playing England, because, you know, I've fought on that side of the divide. And then the All Blacks, if they're playing. Certainly the women's team much more than the men's team. I thought that was just phenomenal play last year. Just what a great tournament to watch.
How amazing is women's sport in general, the whirlwind now that is behind it finally, you know? And I think,
finally, right? Yeah. Like after how long fighting for that? But for me, like watching the Women's World Cup was watching rugby, you know, whereas when you watch the Men's World Cup, you're watching tactics and you're watching like professional play of a different type, and it's not that fun. You know, like there were very few teams in the men's team that play like really open dynamic rugby where it can shift on a dime. You know, the great thing about rugby to me when I grew up was depends who turned up on the day as to who would win. You could have the best team in the world lose against the worst team in the world, in quotes, because it depended on the day. Like there was always that uncertainty, whereas nowadays it's kind of dominated by
the All Blacks.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Not so much in the last year, but certainly has been in the past, and that to me is somewhat boring. There needs to be uncertainty there.
No, for me, like women's sport now, I just can sit there comfortably watching women's sport, just loving it. And like, if you go back, 5-10 years ago, if you're sitting around the pub with a couple of guys and someone said women's sport, someone would scoff and go, oh. Now you're like, fuck yes,
Yeah, I think our generation and below, definitely. It's still the elder generation finds it difficult to treat it as a real sport. And I find it so difficult. My parents-in-law, for example, they have made comments before, that I don't really support or agree with, and you kind of have to have that conversation. And actually, it's really good fun to watch, but it's not real rugby, Yes, it is. It entirely is. Yeah. So
that's a generation there. Like my dad's a little bit like that. He calls me and tells me stuff that's inappropriate, but thinks he's being good about it. Like he'll say, he'll say, that women's sport's pretty terrible, but I'm enjoying watching it. Like, come on, like it's awesome.
I mean, they're just an interesting generation in a whole, right? Like, and I presume when I'm that age, my kids will be saying the same thing about me, where I've just calcified in certain thoughts or areas, hopefully a little bit more progressive again and a bit more progressive again.
I think so. I think the world's becoming a better place with,
I think we're just used to change more, right? Like we're changing more often regularly. This is why we work in the industry we do, because there's one truth in the world and nothing's certain. Nothing's true. Nothing's true forever. It will change, and it's changing more rapidly than ever it has before, whether it's business, economies, politics, or, sport.
And I think it's largely a fact of people like yourself, right, who have had big profiles in industries and have been talking about how things need to change, how we need to be more inclusive, how we need to do this. And people are starting to listen to these voices a lot more now and say, well, actually, yes.
Yeah, I hope so. Like, being in a number of startups, and don't get me wrong, some of them, I've set up teams that were pretty myopic. I remember early days Xero, myself and Tokes were doing a lot of the hiring. And if you look back on that early stage of Xero hiring, lots of people look like me or look like Tokes.
I saw a video because Tokes is coming on the podcast, and I was watching, I watch YouTube videos and everything of people before, and I saw an interview with Tokes with some immigration person about recruiting at Xero, and they did this video about what it's like to work at Xero, and they panned, and I was like, ooh, white guys.
Absolutely, right? Like, and, all with the best intentions. We weren't trying to be exclusionary. Great, we had some women on the team, oh, wow, we should clap. No, it's, in hindsight, that wasn't a great way to set it up. But that's the only way we knew how to test talent. Like, are you able to solve the problems that we were able to solve? Like in our head, how do we test it? Well, we do some, I hate it, but we did coding on a whiteboard. I'd never do that now. It wasn't mature in terms of the thought process. Worked somehow, but maybe it worked despite ourselves. Not because of that hiring. Then moving on, Hoist. I set that up and hired 2 really great graduates. One through EDA. Inspiral Dev Academy, and one through Vic Uni, and those 2 backgrounds coming together was really interesting. And to be honest, one of those I worked with 3 times after that because she was just phenomenal. So it was.
It's good to learn, right? Like, and I think it's good for everyone to see, that people like yourselves saying, we probably didn't get it right. And I think Tokes on that same interview was saying, we didn't get it right, but it was all we knew at the time.
Yeah, totally. This is the thing, right? Like, we can't beat ourselves up about all these mistakes we've made because they were made with good intentions. It was intentions that count, right? Actions count, but the intentions were there. So all I want to do is learn, right? Like, I'm constantly learning what's better, what feedback I get from the community. I've got really good people who are not like me, who can talk to me, who can tell me, Owen, you fucked up here, don't do that again. That was a really stupid thing to do. And I can have those conversations quite openly without fear of, hey, I'll be ostracized from a community, or hey, I made this mistake, nobody will ever talk to me again. Because hopefully they know I'm not, I didn't kill anybody, I wasn't malicious, I wasn't ever going to do, bad things.
Just bias, right?
Yeah,
That's
totally.
all it was.
Unconscious bias is massive. And we really do have to fight that consciously. You know, like I'm a white male, middle class, you know, like I've always had privilege that's taken me to a certain point.
There's a really good, so there's the Harvard test for unconscious bias. I encourage every hiring manager, every person to do it. It's just a good way to figure it, because we all have bias, to figure out where your bias are.
Totally. And then, you know, like every system and process I've got, you know, when I'm talking to hiring tech people into a tech team, what systems can I put in place to fight that bias? You know, like how can we do a good process that means that even though you're going to have that bias, it won't come into play, or you'll have enough data to make a good decision either way. You know, I still meet people and I work for people who are like, you got to hire quickly, and it's like, you got to hire quickly, but with purpose and with good outcomes at the other end.
Awesome. So then how did you get into tech? Owen, like growing up playing rugby and sailing and all these things?
So my auntie had an Atari ST and gave it to our family. So we had a BBC Model B and an Atari ST, and they were just phenomenal machines. You know, the things you could do and the games you could play. And my mum, I credit my mum actually. She was the most awesome person. She bought the old programming books that you could get and would program in the games like for us.
Awesome.
So she would read the code and do it. So picked up BASIC through doing that. My eldest brother was really into computing as well, but my dad said, hey, when he went to university, don't do computing because there's no future in it. So he went and did chemistry instead. And by the time I came through high school, I was probably the most advanced person in computing in my school to a certain extent. Most of it self-taught. So we were one of the first places on the street to get the internet, you know, this magical thing called the internet. You know, I had the AOL disk and was dialing up. I had a bulletin board and a few other things. And I ended up building websites for other people early in the days. Dragon Ball Z was a big thing back then.
Really?
Yeah, it really was.
What was your first website you ever built?
I built one. So we, at school, my high school, we had quite a big tie to NASA. And we used to send people on camp, like space camp, essentially. I did a Flash animation, you know, when Adobe Flash was a big thing, and website around the school projects around that. It's like I'm scratching my memory, but that was kind of the first.
Have you ever gone back on the Wayback Machine to look at any of these websites?
A kind of, you know, like GeoCities when that was a thing. You know, I had a website there, a web rig, and everything else. So I just like. I fell into it to a certain extent, that side of it. I was deeply into software and programming. You know, my dad used to pull me into work and I was the shadow IT guy. So I built him systems on Access and Excel that, you know, powered his practice in medicine.
Because there's no future in IT.
Yeah, because like his IT team in, you know, the NHS were really slow to develop these things that actually he knew would, you know, like it was literally like taking his paper notes and making them more accessible and searchable for him and his secretary. You know, I'm pretty sure that got shut down because now I'm actually a bit more mature. I hate having somebody like me in that team.
The data that you were getting from the NHS
as
a school person.
Totally. No vetting, no nothing. But it was really interesting to see how you could build these systems. And I've just been really interested in computers are so logical, right? Like literally you tell them to do the thing and they do the thing. Humans are the opposite, you know, like I always joke, you know, it would be so much easier to be in business without people, you know, like whether they're the people in the employees or they're your customers, you know, but computers are understandable, they're deeply understandable, and I was good at it. So it was like, oh, I'm good at something. So literally from the age of 15, I knew I wanted to be in computing in some way, shape or form. I went and did computer science at university. With no real thought about what it was or why, but just that I really enjoyed it. And then I picked the university that was furthest away from my parents. So I went Newcastle upon Tyne or Glasgow. And I didn't actually get the grades for Newcastle upon Tyne. So I thought, oh, I'm going to go to Glasgow. Oh, cool, that'll be fun. But then Newcastle phoned up and said, yeah, you're coming anyway. So it's fine.
Awesome.
And I picked it because back in those days, it was the move from C to Java as a language, you know, and I didn't want to go to a university that did Java because everybody was moving to Java. So Newcastle and Glasgow were the two that were sticking on C. And then there was a big announcement just before I started at Newcastle, we're moving to Java. In hindsight, it doesn't really matter at all. But it was just I want to learn the real fundamentals. So C would be the thing.
We're purist.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
And then what was your first job?
So actually, my first job was self-employed, building a little bit of a website during university. So I have I have an email address that I give out, which is iouk.com, and it stands for Ian and Owen in the UK, because it was Ian and who was my partner. And we did one together. So that was technically a paying job, but really, out of university, I took a gap year, went and taught sailing in Greece and skiing in France for a company called Mark Warner, who do holidays. Basically took British people and dumped them in a place and said, hey, you've got a week, you can learn to sail, or you can be guided to ski. So that was technically a paying job, but first job a professional job in IT was a company called Cresta, which was a testing consultancy back in the day. So working in Derby in the UK, which is a weird place to end up in the middle of the Midlands. There was a big bank there called Egg Bank, and we were basically testing all of their systems for them. But this is that back in the day where testing wasn't really understood. So I was a QA to start with, but automated QA. So really building automated tests around all of their platforms and how they build those things. Very quickly, I made it clear that this wasn't for me forever. I didn't like just breaking stuff and not being able to fix it at the other end. I liked being able to do the whole thing. And they pulled me into an internal team. They were building a startup within their own company. They basically had a product that sat over their testing work and allowed people to see the quality and assurance that you were getting out of it. We built that internally out of an office in London for a wee while.
Awesome. Startup before
pretty much, yeah. Cool. So experimented with really core techniques about how you build product. So we were purely extreme programming. There were 4 of us in the team. We were pair programming on everything. Everything was together. I was building the build system, hence the reason why I'm known as Build Master, because that was really my first programming job. I was the Build Master for that team. Built the continuous integration and development system. But that really pulled me into the agile movement, continuous delivery movement, continuous integration movement, and I've been a proponent of that ever since. Because I've seen how badly most software projects are run when they're run as a big bang kind of government style project. Even what we call agile in New Zealand is way behind where the thinking was or should be. It's like agile on paper, but not really. And then met my wife because Cresta was tied to a New Zealand company called Frond. So Frond, big consultancy. We were their partners in London, essentially in the UK. Had a lot of Kiwis who came to London. Was in an office with a bunch of them. Had a party one night and invited some of those friends, and one of them brought a friend to the party, and that turns out to be my wife now. So
And then she dragged you back to New Zealand?
Dragging is probably overstating what it is, but she basically said, my working holiday's over, I'm going to go home. I said, I'm coming with you, pretty much, and ended up living in her parents' house before I'd even really met her parents. So, for a week, because they were in Australia watching the Australian Open. And then they turned up and there was this random boy in their house. But we had met, we had talked before, but not physically met. And they've been great ever since. So,
awesome. Yeah. And so then, what was your first job in New Zealand?
So I worked for Optimation, working on the systems for TAB. So, the scroll at the bottom of the screen that shows you all the betting odds and everything else, we built that at that time. So I was working on that system. Found it deeply frustrating to be behind a salesperson. So, where as a technologist, I'm going, well, you need to rebuild all these things because what you want isn't what you're getting. You're not getting bang for your buck. You need to go and do a few of these core fundamental things, and then you'll get really core value. And the salesperson's like, nah, I can't sell that. Don't want to do it. Sorry. So spoke to Mindscape because they were advertising for a senior software engineer, so JD and Jeremy Boyd back in those days. It's quite obvious that they didn't want me. They wanted a very particular person that I wasn't the right fit for, but they introduced me to a guy called Craig, who was the CTO at Xero, this random startup called Xero, and fell into a conversation and ended up meeting him and Rod, and then Rodgery, and ending up. That's it. I totally get your vision. Totally get where you're going.
What employee number were you at Xero?
I don't know officially, but somewhere in the 20s. So
So still, they just moved out of the apartment?
Just out of the apartment. So just after IPO. So it's about a month after they IPO'd.
Old Bank Arcade.
Yeah. So we were in a massively swimming office, loads of space, and then within like 2 months, it was really cramped because we were just hiring like crazy because we had a vision and a mission and had to get the people on bodies on the ground to do that. What a great experience to watch a rocket ship from the inside. You know?
Did you know there was something special about Xero when you started?
I'd like to believe so, but how many people tell a really good story and you believe that there's something special? It's, like I can validate it now in hindsight. Rod was amazingly persuasive as a storyteller. As a founding storyteller, that's what you want. You want to believe that there's such a mission and vision here. And actually the mission and vision is something that they're kind of only getting to now, where accounting was supposed to be the beachhead into the back office, right? Like for small business, it was never supposed to be just accounting. It was always supposed to be quite broad. Turns out accounting's really hard, and you have to do a lot of work on it, and you have to get it right. But then it's incredibly sticky. But I remember the Christmas before Craig Winkler invested, we kind of all thought we were going to be out of a job coming back in January, February, and then Rod, announced another investment, which was great. He was phenomenally good at just keeping us going, keeping our vision and mission, no matter how tight that tightrope was, and that startup life for you. And it was great fun. I learned a whole bunch of stuff, but I also ignored a whole bunch of stuff that I should have learned, and I've only really understood some of those learnings or lessons post as I've gone into other startups or started my own things. And,
But that's life.
And I've got a lot of failures under my belt, which is great. I actually, not great from an investor point of view, but, I've wasted a lot of money, but that money is investment in me learning a whole bunch of different things around what makes a good startup versus what makes a bad startup, what really is important versus not, those kind of things.
So what do you think is the one thing that you take from the early days Xero that you're like, all right, this is something that I would carry through into the next startup?
So the one thing I have taken through is openness. There was never a moment in Xero's days where I didn't feel like the exec team were being incredibly open, incredibly honest around what we were doing and why we were doing it. I remember Rod being nudged by his CFO. You can't say that. You literally can't say that in an all hands. But he did anyway because he knew it was important. It was about honesty and transparency. Because otherwise, why are you following this leader if they're going to turn around and go, actually, I was lying to you. We're going over here instead. Or actually, I've got to let all of you go, and you had no inkling that there was anything going wrong. That's never a good thing to hit. So I've always believed in transparency and openness and honesty from exec. I know there are certain things you can't talk about, and I don't expect them to go into depth around why somebody was let go or something else. Those things are private for a reason, and they're legally private sometimes. But I will always endeavor to let people know what's going on to the best of my abilities that I can. Because honestly, if you know that and then you want to bail, you should have bailed anyway, right? It's not the place for you. You've got to be around uncertainty.
That for me, everyone asks me, what's good culture, and how do you scale culture? And in my experience, the only way to scale a good culture, because we're talking about culture, right? It's 5 people around a table like this, in the early days, everyone's just having fun and working, and you're like, how do you take that and then scale that? And I keep saying to people, the only way you can do it is just be completely transparent, honest with everyone, and say, this is going to change. This is what's going to happen. And then it's going to happen.
And you're going to fuck up a lot. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to have the wrong people. You're going to do the wrong thing. You're going to go in the wrong direction. Because you've got to try these things. You've got to experiment. And don't get me wrong, you want everybody to understand why you made the decision, which is where the openness and transparency comes in. It's it's not a, hey, why did we do that? There was no data around it. It's really easy to say that after the fact. Yes, that was a mistake. We shouldn't have gone that.
I 100% agree.
Most of my startups, that have not worked have been really obvious in hindsight. At the time, it's very, very hard because we were trying to prove that thing that couldn't be done. That's what a startup is. You're trying to prove something that hasn't been done yet in a world that doesn't exist yet. So you've got to try some things that look a bit stupid on paper, because some of them might work. There's
a bit of a trend there. So Vend, I worked at Vend. I can't remember what number I was, maybe pre-100 or something. But the same thing, we had complete transparency and had an open door policy on meetings. So you could go to any meeting that you chose to. Not that you'd probably go and sit on every exec meeting, but if you saw something on the agenda that was interesting to you, you could go and sit in the room or jump or dial in these days. And it's saying that people just felt empowered by the honesty and the transparency of the business and as it was growing. And so
I think it's just, I've met a lot of founders who are deeply scared by openness and honesty because they think it's their job to shield their team from these uncertainties. I do have to talk them through to, what's the worst that's going to happen?
Yeah.
Well, that person's going to leave. Okay, do you think they're going to stick around when they find out the truth? Because it will come out, right? Like, it will happen.
Yeah.
And the answer is no. It's like, well, would you prefer that they left knowing the thing early and they're still your friend and they're still, that understand why the decision was made?
And they won't take 5 people with them because they felt betrayed.
100%. Yeah. So it can be so self-destructive when you start to try and protect people from information that actually, is just part and parcel of being in an uncertain world of a startup, right?
Yeah,
So,
awesome. Man.
Yeah.
What was the thing that you're most proud of at Xero that you personally contributed to?
I think that's a really good question because I don't really know, right? Like I look at Xero, blue sticker, I'm immensely proud of the product that we created, how we created it. We were one of the first internet companies out of New Zealand with a big product, right? Like not just internally focused New Zealand product. We always used to joke around, people would either go to Xero or to Trade Me. Yeah. And we used to joke to everybody, why would you go to Trade Me? Only New Zealanders
the wars in the windows.
Right? Like, yeah, totally. Yeah. Whereas we were globally focused and people would be using us from around the world. That mission paid out. I am deeply proud that we created an engineering culture. It wasn't just a sales and marketing led culture. It was very much we cared about how things fitted together and we were able to have those conversations around building some good systems. I think I'm proud that good people worked there and they were given really good opportunities to learn growth and scale. And, I count some of my best friends from that time, and, we have created wealth for New Zealand. So that's been a really good byproduct of creating good export economy products,
Yeah. And do you think largely like Rod's aggressive vision sort of helped with that? Or do you think just everyone contributed to that?
Everybody contributed, right? Everybody's part of the machine. It can't be one person. It can never only be one person. Rod, don't get me wrong, his laser focus and this is going to succeed no matter what. Hugely useful. He knew the vision. He knew what it could become. He knew where we could go, and he understood economics, right? He knew how to sell it, how to make it a good product. But we would never have survived had we not solved a whole bunch of problems along the way from, how do you scale the sales team? We started out, even when I joined, it was thinking, the biggest sale would be taking people from competitors who we just didn't like, it's not we didn't like the people or the products, it's just the clunkiness of working with those systems because nobody else was online, the workflow was so much easier. Turned out that's not true. Actually, our biggest sale was from people just starting up up with a new business because that's, less inertia. So most people came from pen and paper and people weren't changing accounting systems. Originally, I think, people were thinking, oh, we don't need an accountant if we're running Xero. Yeah. Turns out, actually, accountants were a bigger sales force. They were so good at selling a system that they could work really well in. So that all those shifts that had to happen along the way, they didn't come from, one person. They came from observations of the market. Philip with his amazing view for design and where he could go there. So, I think it was a very, very driven team. We were all driven to succeed. I spent weekends working occasionally on some things that just had to get done. Yeah. I remember Xero Personal when we were launching that. Just spent a couple of weekends pre-launch just trying to get the grids to work properly the way that we wanted them to. Really deeply technical challenges. Yeah. Stupid now, that was so simple. But, these things exist now. I could get them off the shelf. But back in those days, it just didn't exist. So, I remember a data center going down in rack space where we were hosted in Virginia, and Facebook went offline and Twitter went offline, and we were the only ones talking to our customers around what was going on. And turned out they were doing a power test at the same time as a truck drove into their generator. Oh, wow. And so everything went down. But it was amazing to see that we were on the same level as Twitter and Facebook back in those days. Nowadays they've got data centers up the wazoo, but it was fun. It was there's just those scrappy moments where you're learning. Social media became a thing. We succeeded because Catherine went out and became Orange Girl on Twitter.
Yeah,
And
the OG.
yeah. And she just owned that space because Twitter was around about 2007. Like it was a very similar. It was just a genesis of a lot of different products at the same time.
Yeah.
As we all grappled with the next stage of the internet and what it would mean and how it would happen. Nowadays, you kind of take all of these things for granted.
Yeah.
But they just didn't exist.
Yeah.
They just did not exist. And it was so much fun to invent some of that stuff.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So you were, at the time you left Xero, you were chief architect?
Yeah, I was chief architect. I like to explain to people I was not people management, but I was the technical side of CTOing here in Wellington. So Craig, our CTO, was beachheading America. He was kind of our first employee to really go into America and stay there because he just loves America, always has
New York,
done.
hey? Yeah.
He's now in New York. So he did 2 stints while I was there. He did New York, then came back, then went to San Francisco, then came back and went back to New York. I think New York was always his dream. Like that's where he wanted to be, and he is. He's loving it there as far as I know.
Is he still with Xero?
No, he's recently, like within the last year or two, moved on. So yeah, couldn't tell you the company he's with right now, but back at the early scrappy days, I think. It was pretty much leading the technology challenges of the team. In hindsight, nobody told me what that job was or how to do it or why to do it or what my outcomes were. I was just the most senior engineer on the team, I guess, who they trusted to do these things. So took me aside and said, hey, we'd like you to take this role. It was kind of just to keep some technical direction going and make some good architectural decisions around the place. But yeah, I think I could have set that job up a little bit better in hindsight. Had I known, like my job was to not bike shed everything, whereas I was very egalitarian. I was like, I've got really great senior people around. I want you all to have an opinion. Yeah. And like, there's no wrong opinion, but there were lots of opinions, as you can imagine. And actually my job was to go in and pick one, when there's no clear winner. I only understood that afterwards, really. That was really what my core job was. And then to be hiring and to be recruiting and to be a voice for the tech team around New Zealand. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I remember recruiting for you back in the day. You probably don't remember it, but I used to recruit for you, Tokes, and Philip.
Yeah.
I hated recruiting for Philip. He was the hardest hiring manager. He hated everyone. Hated every CV.
He was always very perfectionist. Like it's the design mindset, right? Like I like to say, designers are just naturally unhappy with everything because that's why they're designing. They look at that and go, "Oh, that's really badly designed. I could do that so much better." And it's a door or something, and I'm like, I'm just walking through the door. I don't really understand why you're so grumpy, but
like he made a few of my candidates cry from interviewing.
Wow.
But you and Tokes were good interviewers because you had a bit of a system that you would do, and so I used to tell candidates, this is the process, these are the things. And Tokes even had a blog, I think, at the time that he wrote on what makes a good interview. And
totally. I do remember, like, I loved interviewing with Tokes in the room. It was a good, like, double act we had, essentially. We knew how each other thinks, and then, it would just come down to how it wasn't very scientific. I'm sorry to anybody I interviewed at that period of time. Sometimes you'd lose out on the job for no real good reason apart from we didn't feel like you would succeed, but we couldn't always put a name to it or
just going off gut feel.
Sometimes it was gut feel. After an hour's conversation, it's like, I'm really sorry, but I don't think it's going to work. Sometimes within 10 minutes. And the one thing I do like about Tokes and myself is we would tell the candidate as soon as we knew. We wouldn't waste an hour. It would be like, I'm really sorry, this isn't going to work. Very rarely.
In my opinion, that's the best way to do it.
Yeah. Very rarely. Don't get me wrong. And usually it was really fundamental. Like you just
not there yet.
Not there. And try and guide them as to what they should go and work on. There were some companies that we'd interview people who came from that company, and then we go. I think FNZ back in those days was notorious for driving people
to work all night, and
bad employer in my books, and the people who came out of there were scarred by that. And Xero wasn't the place to rehabilitate, so we were very open and honest about that. It's like, it's not you, it's the fact that you've got some of these baggage and scars that you're going to bring, and you're going to have a detrimental experience here. So we were caring. But that probably didn't feel like it to the person who's just been told you're not going to get a job.
It must be hard, though, as a hiring manager of a company that is deemed the place to work, right? to
Yeah.
be considerate, because that becomes everyone's dream job all of a sudden,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're the one responsible for telling them yes and no about their dreams, right?
A lot of pressure, but I didn't really feel it that way. I was always thinking, is this the person who would take my job eventually? I hope they will. Rod had a really good saying, is you're hiring your replacements.
Yeah.
And he didn't mean like you're leaving. He meant you're going to go and do a different job.
Yeah.
And that's the thing with startups, right? Like everybody's evolving. Every job is evolving. I've taken that to heart. In early stage startups, you're generally hiring people who will replace you in the work that you're currently doing so that you're freed up to do other work.
Yeah.
I remember we opened up a graduate recruitment program while I was at Xero, and I sat with myself and Tokes, I think, sat with a stack of around about 800 CVs to get 10 placements, and it was demoralizing.
Yeah.
It was like, there are this many people who really want to work in tech who cannot get a job and are desperately just flinging out their CVs. Some of them were so ill thought out, it was obvious that they were just scattergunning to everybody.
Yeah.
But some of them were like, oh, I wish I could get like 20 or 30 of you. I mean, nowadays I think their recruitment for graduates is much bigger, but the first batch was, they were sat around a boardroom table, so it couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, Great that we started it. But
grad recruitment back in the day was horrendous too. Like some of the shit that people used to make them do, like put 20 people in a dark room with no lights on, and they've got to figure out a task that's in there and all this shit people. I'm like, oh yeah. But we learned. So then, why do you leave Xero at its peak to then go and do your own startup?
Yeah, interesting. I always joined Xero knowing that I was interested in how the foundation of businesses happen, like how that early genesis works. So a friend of mine, Andrew Buttel, who had previously worked at Xero, had his own company building add-ons to Xero. Endgame, yeah. And he was building a number of add-ons that were looking very similar to each other. And he tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, I've got this idea. I'd like to build a platform to build this kind of application on. And I was looking at those days, it was the JavaScript in the front end was getting more and more complicated every single day. The back ends were not easy to get into for web. And I was like, I remember building my first websites, and it was literally get a notepad, write HTML tags at the top and bottom, and that was it. That was all you had to do, and you've suddenly got table format. It was awful for a front end developer now, but really fundamentally easy to get a website up and running. We'd lost that somewhere along the way. And I was like, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way than this. So I was deeply interested in the idea. He asked me to come on as a founding CTO, essentially, take a bit of a percentage and be paid as well. So it was a paid job. I was like, yeah, I'm going to have to see this through. I'm going to have to try. So it was just a niche that I had to scratch.
That was Hoist?
So we started Hoist.
Yep.
Still like my baby. I love it so much. I wish we could have made that a success. I still wish it existed. Like there are so many days where I go, I wish this exists. So it was.
I remember as a young recruiter back in the day, not that it was that long ago, but that you and who was that? Jamie? Was it Jamie? Yeah, I remember just knowing of you guys, and Jamie moved to the States, and I was like, man, this would be so cool if you guys get this off the ground so fast globally.
Yeah. So we were always global from day one focused, because this was a developer product, and we were talking to VCs or high net worth people in New Zealand, and the first questions are you in accounting? No. Are you in agriculture? No. Then I don't want anything to do with you. Sorry, don't understand it. Developers, what are developers? I don't understand it. Developer experience? So timing wasn't great. I remember being in, this was so early days, we could get in the room with anybody. So I've been in the room with Microsoft execs and AWS execs talking about, hey, you can totally host code without a server. You could put a function that just runs in a machine that we can own and we can host, and it's so easy.
So let's stop there for a second.
Yeah.
So how do you prepare to get into the room with these people? Talk me through, what did you do and what were you thinking about to then go out and pitch?
We had a number of different pitches that came, whether it was we were asking for money or whether we were asking for customers. And really, one thing is everybody likes to, in Silicon Valley. So we did, we very quickly got over to San Francisco and knew that was the place we needed to be, right? The Valley was where developers were. That's where people understood our tooling and what we were doing. So we very quickly got over there. We got through all of our connections in New Zealand saying, who can we get in the room with? Ben Capes was really, really good at introducing us to a bunch of people in the cloud. He was
the cloud guy there.
He was the cloud guy, right? So ended up talking to some people at Salesforce and Heroku through introductions from him. And then they would introduce us to another person to go and talk to. It's like, hey, here's my thoughts. I'd like you to go and talk to X, Y, and Z. We were young, naive, really didn't know what was going on, but we were following all these breadcrumbs. And everybody was really like trying to work out whether we were worth investing in. And giving us some advice along the way. Were you
nervous walking into these rooms with these people? Or
always. And it was so funny. So we would do Sandhill Road, which is where all the VCs are, and I think we did like 4 on a day sometimes. Like you go to Bessemer or one of the other VC firms. All the names now escape me suddenly. But then we'd go home to our rented apartment that we'd had for a couple of months. And Silicon Valley, the TV show, was launching. And literally, I cannot watch that show because it brings back a bit of PTSD. So it's like, I've had that conversation.
That's really
good. My conversation.
I remember working at 8i when Silicon Valley was a thing and they were talking about the compression algorithm. And then I'd watch that TV show at night and I'm like, oh my God.
It's so true. That it's not even a parody, really, sometimes. It's
it's so true. So I remember Huge. This is before you were at 8i, said to me, hey, Troy, we need a compression algorithm researcher. And then he took me into the room and started writing compression algorithms on the whiteboard. And I was like, I have no idea. Like, this is all flying over my head. But I was like, okay, just taking mad notes and trying to figure out what this person does. And he was talking about the Google's V.969 algorithm, compression algorithm. And then later that night, I'm laying in bed watching Silicon Valley. And then I see them writing that compression algorithm on the whiteboard, and I was looking at it, and I said to my wife at the time, my ex-wife now, I said,
I've been in that room.
That actually looks like a real algorithm.
Yeah.
So then I Googled compression algorithm specialist forced TV show Silicon Valley, and then this article pops up, Mistra, the compression specialist that IBM Watson consults to. And so I reached out to him, and a week later we were interviewing him at 8i. It was crazy. That show.
And I do believe that this is a second-hand story, so I can't guarantee that it was true. But one of the pitches that the 8i crew went into, there was a producer from Silicon Valley in the room listening to the pitch to understand what those conversations were. So it's just freaky. But this was exactly the time when the first season of Silicon Valley launched. We were trying to raise money for Hoist. And it's just awful. But you're basically, you're just introduced from person to person to person, and everybody's trying to find. Well, I'd like to say that most of the investors are looking for red flags, right? Like 2 or 3 red flags. We instantly had one because none of us lived in America or were American, so it was always going to be a remote investment, which wasn't that clear back in the day for them. Like, it was a higher risk thing. The second one is, we were pre-product, we were pre-launch. We very quickly got a technical product together, but it was early days and wired together. And then the third one, could have been anything that they just didn't like in the list. So we ended up raising a little bit of capital, but not a huge amount. And all of it from one VC firm here in New Zealand. That was trickled out over a course of 3 months, by which point we kind of spent that money on marketing, sales, delivery. It was very little amount of money and hard to come by as well. So we were struggling. It was a hard, rocky road to get that product going. I still love it, as I said. Like, the idea that you can get an application and just give it to somebody else to host. But then, after having glazed looks at us from the Microsoft execs when we're talking about that concept, lo and behold, a year later, Azure has Azure Function, AWS has Lambda, and it's like, oh, well, that was the basis, but you missed all of the juice that we actually put on top of that. So it's like, there's still a market for it, I think, but nah, it's I feel like that boat has sailed. So.
Like, everything's now they're automating and no code, and so there's an appetite now.
Yeah, so we were very much in the same space as Zapier and a few others. That's hence the reason why I got to know the Zapier founders early on. And then so we gave that a 4-year push. Ended up in conversations with Orion Health to see if Hoist could be their developer portal. Essentially, that's where we thought we could do really good sales, was build a Hoist version white labeled for Xero or Orion Health. They did a restructure, like literally a month after we started conversations, so it wasn't going to happen. So yeah, and then we went, we're kind of out of capital, we're out of ideas.
Time to move on.
Yeah, we had to move on. So came and spoke to AI, and after talking to Tokes. So
Yeah. And then, so what did you do? What did you come to 8i to do?
I was building out the platform.
8i is a virtual reality holographic
so volumetric video. So basically 48 cameras all synchronized on a green stage that can reproduce what it sees in 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing technology, don't get me wrong. I was building out the cloud-based systems to do that. So taking what had to be on a stage to start with and seeing whether we could produce it in cloud, with the idea that we'd scale the stages, lots of stages, all producing on our platform, way in advance of where we should have been. In hindsight, like we really should have been thinking about.
It sounds like a lot of your career, you've sort of just been on the precipice before, just slightly before.
It's timing, right? So built a really good team there, ended up as their VP of engineering.
Yep.
Through a change of CEO, that kind of just made sense. I kind of emailed the incoming CEO and just said, hey, the culture's not where it should be in Wellington, New Zealand, just so you know. Love to help you on that. And he said, hey, love your help. Would you mind being the VP of engineering? I went, I'll have a conversation first. So I had a chat to him, and it turned out, had a really good exec team that I was working with.
Is that Steve? Or
so Steve, and then worked with Tony, and it was a really good group of people who I learned a lot from.
How's that working at 8i? Because for people listening or watching that don't know 8i had a really big research R&D team. And so you're working with a lot of researchers that are embedded as a part of your tech, and I imagine that that's not something that you'd work with.
It's not a natural lens that I have, like I'm not a research engineer, I'm not, not writing scientific papers, and it was really interesting to work with them. Like sometimes interesting is a code word for hard and painful, and there were moments where it was hard and painful, don't get me wrong, because I didn't know what they were doing really on a day-to-day basis. I couldn't get that balance right in my head, for me, it was, we're building a product company. We have to invest in product and get something to market. And for them, it's like, I really want the blacks to be blacker. I'm being facetious, but like that kind of conversation. I'm like, do we know which customer cares about the blacks? No. So, I've always been this experimental. You learn from the customers, you learn from the market, and then you feed that into what research you should be doing. Whereas, for them, their whole career has been built on the next paper that they build, they write or do or publish, which totally understand. Don't get me wrong, it's not wrong or right, it's just different. And I found that working environment particularly complex and hard. I will admit it was one of the harder groups that I've
Do you think it was good though for you in terms of your career to try and learn how to manage these people?
Yeah. So I'm an advisor now into a few different startups. Some of them are deeply in AI and that kind of things, which also relies on a lot of research, and I can help them understand that different mindset, because while I've not done it, I've still felt, I've had feedback and I've had conversations with them, but it's a brutal world. Like research is brutal. It is, they have to stand on their peers to get one rung ahead and publish that paper first or whatever it is. It's just, it rewards really weird behaviors. To me, really weird behaviors. They're all lovely, lovely people, but I remember one of the team at 8i was in nights all the time, and I just had to sit him down and go, "Why are you doing this? Like, we've not got a massive deadline you've got to hit. Nobody's telling you to do this. It's like, I don't feel good enough. This is the only way I can feel like I'm getting ahead." And I had to have a conversation with him around, this isn't healthy, right? Like you're taking your tiredness and you're out on the rest of the team. Like he was notorious, like people knew he had moods essentially. And I was like, you've got to calm down. Like this isn't healthy. Whereas, my application engineers kind of understood that because they've been around product companies for a long time. They know this is a long burn. This isn't just a moment in time.
There wasn't many places, like if you think for where researchers, like the game studios or the big research shops, and they were treated pretty poorly in those places. Yeah.
VFX has always been a grind to the bottom, right? Like, the studios will take the VFX production to wherever it's cheapest to get that done. That's notorious, and a lot of these people have come from Weta Digital, and, I remember early stories about Weather Digital. None of them are, I can't corroborate any of them, but like of people sleeping under desks, of working on massive deadlines that movie has to get shipped at that time, and you're getting paid until you do it, right? But not well enough to sleep under your desk. But just grinding people and burning them out really quickly.
I've heard the same stories.
Yeah.
So I was part of ADI as well. I worked in the people and culture team, did a lot of the recruiting. And I always heard really good feedback about you as a manager there from the researchers and the engineers and the likes. And that's something that I've constantly heard about you. I want to talk about this in a bit more detail because for me, there's like technical managers, like it's, especially when it's a startup, like all of a sudden, fuck, you're the CTO and you're managing all the people now.
Yeah.
What do I do? Most of them never had experience with that before, probably don't have as...
Especially in New Zealand, right?
Yeah.
Like this is Xero to a T. I had a whole bunch of managers who became managers, myself included, who never got training, never understood what management was. It was like, okay, so now do I tell people what to do? It took me actually till 8i and getting an executive coach as part of my role, which I'll always say is the most advantageous thing I've ever had, is somebody to sit me down, a neutral party, have a conversation with, and really bounce ideas off, and for me to understand what management was, why I existed, which is to enable a space where great work can happen. It's not to do the great work. It's not to be the one who can do all the great work. It's to make sure that people are producing their best work ever. And that's not lots of work. That's smart work, right? Like that's working the right things at the right time. And the way that you do that as a good manager for me is it's all about setting context. It's all about that openness and transparency. It's about making sure that the person who's going to be making the decision, which is usually the person who's doing the work, has enough information that they will make the right decision at the time. Because as soon as they've got to go and ask somebody else, well, you've just wasted a whole bunch of time. You're going to get a layer of like a different story or something. And then, it goes off the rails. That's always the way it goes off the rails, is when people don't have the context of why decisions are being made or what the outcome that people are focused on. So I coach a lot of CTOs out of a startup world because they're exactly that, right? They're tech people who are really good at their job, and now suddenly they're managing people, or now they're leader of a whole department. Like, what the fuck? How do I do this? How do I actually get good at this? And really coach them on, not owning all of the things, not holding on to this skill that you had, which is usually writing software, right? Or solving software problems, and deciding whether you're actually going to be a people manager or not. Because a lot of tech leaders, founders, are not given that knowledge to know that there's multiple options here. You can become a people leader, but you don't have to. Like, if you really get your buzz from the flow, from the technical challenges, you can go and be a technical focused person. You can be the foundational engineer forever, because nobody's going to kick you out of your own startup, right? But it does mean that you have to back your skills up with somebody else, right? So, if you're a CTO who really wants to go technical, I always advise you're looking for a VP of engineering at some point, or you're looking for those core managers who can really enable a good performing team. But you want them at the same level so that they can have really core conversations together and make decisions together, but also present them to the whole exec team, because really it's the people that make a company, no matter what. Like, you're always working with this group of people, and it's what this group of people can achieve and what can the outcome be with these people. You can't change the people. You can change all of the rest of the things, but you're not going to change the people. I mean, don't get me wrong, you can, because people will leave and you hire new people, but fundamentally you're trying to solve the problem with these people. And it's, some people are really good at certain things and really bad at other things and need information in different ways. Like the same message delivered 20 times can be heard in 20 different ways by different people, right? So
what do you say to someone who's listening to this that's just taken their first technical management role? And like, I hear a lot of people that I interview them, and they'll say, oh, I don't want to be a manager, I want to stay technical, but I want my career to grow, and I don't feel like I can grow as fast on that side. And so they say, maybe I should be a technical manager. And so sometimes they'll jump into that role purely because of money or career growth. And they're like, holy fuck, what do I do now? So what would you say for them as some good outlets to do straight away? Obviously, mentoring for you was a big thing.
Yeah, so I do believe in getting mentors or getting a coach, or because it worked for me. So that's a bit of bias, that kind of sense.
Why did it work for you?
It was a safe space that I've never had before, where I could talk about the challenges I was having, and then with a 50,000 foot view, be asked, outcome-focused questions. Like what am I trying to actually achieve here? And so that space to actually mull over some questions and ideas and get better self-awareness. So, self-awareness is key when you're a manager. You've got to know, if I don't eat breakfast before 8 a.m., and I'm in a meeting in that morning, I'm going to be this kind of person when I show up, because your job is to be in meetings and shuffling information and being in charge of people. The hardest thing for engineers when they go into management is the feedback loop. So when you're an engineer and you're a software engineer and you're writing code, your feedback loop is I write the code, it works, I commit, I do a pull request and somebody accepts that pull request, I get an endorphin hit, right? That's the reward cycle. It's pretty short. It's usually a day or two at most. Hopefully it's an hour. For a manager, depending on how high up, your cycles get longer and longer and longer. So, I'm an exec. My cycle is about a year before I know the decision I made today, whether that was the right decision to make, because it's whether the team is still producing great quality software or, we're going in the right direction or we've not run out of money. That's a long period of time before you know whether you're doing a good job. I never actually know whether I'm doing a good job, right? Like that's the truth of my job is I think I'm doing all right, but would they have succeeded without me? Don't know, because there's no A/B test, right? Like I can't have another team where I don't manage and go, cool, you're the same people, can you achieve the same thing? So you kind of just got to have a little bit of gumption to back yourself and go, I think I'm doing all right. I think the other side is you've got to want the team to succeed. It's not about you anymore, it's about them, and you succeed in like this reflected glory, as it were. I never do anything really on the code anymore or in the tools for most of the startups that I'm a core manager for, because that's not my job. And actually, if I wrote the code, I'd do a really shitty job because somebody else hasn't learned to write that code. It's not because I wouldn't be able to write that code. I could totally solve it. But, I've lost the opportunity to teach 3 different people how the system works or how to solve this problem. And that's the job of a good manager. So, like the CTOs that I coach, the challenge is they want to solve the problem as fast as possible, and that's usually them getting involved, right? That's the quickest way from I've got a problem, it's solved. I know how all the system works because I built the damn thing. I could totally do that. What I point out to them is, okay, you've solved that problem. It's going to happen again in a month or 2 months' time. You've lost all of this opportunity to get knowledge shared and more people working on it and more people understanding, so that eventually you can step out or do other things or do better things, like you're not actually floating multiple boats, right? You're not getting better. That's the thing. You're just always going to be solving this problem.
I remember, I can't remember which CTO said it to me, but he used that coach sporting mentality, like the analogy where he was like, I couldn't be a good CTO until I pulled myself out of the game so I could see the whole game and be able to figure out what was going on in the future as well.
So that's why I love coaching. That's why I love mentoring. It's so that I can be a 50,000 foot view for somebody else. And then hopefully I can take some of those things when I experience the same thing again. It's like, oh yeah, I've just talked about this. I should totally do that. It's one of my medicine, as it were.
Can everyone be a good technical manager?
No, I think you've got to want to at a simple level. Like it's not for everybody. And by technical manager, I mean people manager over technical people, right? Like you can totally be a technical manager where you're an architect or you're a principal engineer and you're deciding how systems are built together and you're trying to collaborate together. Like that's a different skill. It's a management skill, but it's not a people management skill. I'm talking about people managers over technical people. No. I think anybody with any background can be. So I don't believe that you have to be a software engineer to manage software people. I think some software people need a software background person to manage them, if that makes sense. It's not the manager, it's the person that's got the problem.
They want the credibility.
It's like, oh, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. It's the bullshit factor. It's like being able to call bullshit. So you need a baseline level of like, that's not true, is it? That's really not true. When you say that's going to take 6 months, you're bullshitting, right? Like you're overthinking the problem usually, right? Like that's the problem with technical people. Gross generalization, but is that they're quite perfectionist or they like to go into the detail because they've been burned by these things before, not doing that. So they end up with like, I've overthought the problem, whereas actually the outcome that I want is over here. And the good manager will go, this is the outcome I want, not this is the solution I want built. This is the outcome I want. How quickly can I get there? Or these are the things I'm optimizing for. Like if I'm in a startup, I'm optimizing for time because time is money, and cost. So, it's like, okay, this is the outcome I want. How quickly can I get there, and how quickly can it be run? That's why we make very quick decisions in startups and sometimes build shit tech. So,
Yeah, well, MVP Live. Right? Yeah. So did you take a lot of these learnings into JRNY, and what was different about going from 8i? Because you went 8i JRNY?
I went 8i, and then I worked for Zapier for a year.
Oh, that's right.
That was deliberate. I knew the founders of Zapier, got in touch with them and said, hey, I'm on the market. And Zapier had always been a poster child of remote work.
Yeah.
So I wanted to experience what it was like to be in a remote first company, spread around the world.
Yeah. Tough.
Yeah, it was really fun. It was great fun because it was pre-pandemic. Get vaccinated. It was pre that period of time. So we were traveling. I went to America a couple of times to meet my team and a few other people. And the founders of Zapier really understood that you have to invest in that trust, like getting people together. So remote working is great because you start with trust, right? Like I trust that whoever's online is working. I don't really care. I expect they're doing their best job because I'm doing my best job. And so, whether I'm hanging washing occasionally or not doesn't really matter because I'll get the good outcomes. So you're outcome focused when you're remote first.
Yeah.
You communicate
you're
well.
half your team on the other side of the world, right? So you'd be working completely different time
zones.
zones.
Yeah. So I had that was the hardest thing for me. So I was managing a team, one of the more high performing teams at Zapier in terms of we were high growth, we were getting a lot of shit done, and we were also driving a lot of the engine for Zapier's growth as a product. But I had one person in Africa reporting to me. All of the time zones in America had somebody in them reporting to me, and then somebody in Sydney reporting to me. So it meant my day started at like 5 or 6 a.m. I'd be done by 1 p.m., but I couldn't get into a co-working space on a casual basis and be allowed in at 6 a.m. So it ended up being, I live in Upper Hutt, which is, I like the rural lifestyle, but you're kind of lonely. And when you get at 1 p.m. and it's like, okay, cool, now what do I do? There's nobody around. Like, there's nobody I can go and have a coffee with or anything else. So I found it deeply lonely after a year. Got speaking to Mike, who's the founder of JRNY. He was just desperately trying to find a good technical person to come and lead the team. They didn't know whether they wanted CTO or something else. And I had a conversation with them. And he said, hey, I'd love you to interview for a CTO role.
JRNY was an AI insurance
solution. The concept for JRNY was that we were transforming the way that insurance is sold. At a simple level, that's the mantra for at the point where I joined JRNY. It evolved from a number of different ideas. Bot the Builder back in the day, where chat was the core. But the idea being, can you create a fluent interface that will allow you to understand what you're buying insurance for and why you're buying it and how much it's costing. Quite hard to launch a new insurance company, so we didn't really want to go down that route. We didn't want to be an insurance company. We wanted to transform the way insurance companies sold their products or had a conversation with their market. So we worked with IAG for all the time I was there, essentially trying to get the first product out the door, which is generally powering. So IAG is a big insurer here in New Zealand. We were trying to power their car insurance sales process. And we were having really good success. It was a really good kind of fluid interface. They understood why, and we were giving them really good data on, what they were going to get out the other end. But prior to launch, the world went to a shit storm, and IAG changed their tactics from really acquiring new customers to retaining the customers they had, which led to a cancellation of a deal and therefore not the runway that we thought we had. We had a little bit of cash in the bank, and we were contemplating whether we could launch a different product, really consumer focused, rather than selling into enterprise, like really launch our own insurance product. But through time and conversation, hearts weren't in it, so we didn't really want to go through another grind of really starting again. Well, Mikey especially didn't. He's written a lot about it.
He's doing a lot in that space now, which is cool. I love. For me, we got to lose the word failure. It's just attempt.
100%.
Change it to attempt. First attempt.
I'm the king of attempts. Like some of my shots have gone on goal, but you won't score any goals if you don't take any shots, right? I'm littered with attempts. So my first one was You Snap Us, which was like I won the Wellington startup weekend with, and then said, oh, cool, I've got a startup business. And then I remember going to the wedding show in Wellington and handing out cards and showing people what USnappers was. We got no inquiries from that. It was like, I think there's something fundamentally wrong with this business. And it was, the idea was, you're at weddings, people are going to turn up with their smartphones. Why not get all those photos in one place? It kind of made sense. But people didn't actually want to encourage people to use their smartphones at weddings, or didn't like those photos for various reasons. I could totally understand, but it wasn't something.
You talked to Jason about that.
Yeah. So I was working with Jason Naylor as well, like alongside. He's a good friend of mine.
Yeah.
And, we were banding around the ideas of what we could do. But my heart wasn't in it. It wasn't something that I wanted to pursue for a 10-year journey, right? Like, if you want to start a startup, you've got to be in it for 10 years because that's really what it's about.
What's your view on when you're going around with an early stage product that potentially could change the game or could create something that's not there yet, and people are telling you, oh no, we don't need that, it's not a thing, but you in your mind know it could be a thing. What's your view on how do you push through that barrier?
It's an interesting one, right? Like, because sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. My focus is on proof. So, everything you're trying to do is just get a little bit more proof. All of startups are like controlled experiments to a certain extent. Until you're a business making money, you're all in experimentation mode. So, the one hindsight from JRNY is it took us too long to get to launch and we were kind of fooling ourselves.
That's your insurance companies as a
insurance,
customer.
enterprise, it was a slow moving space. It was that was the death knell for us, was because we were in that space. Developers are really classic. I was talking to people around Hoist, and every developer I went into a room with, it's like, yeah, cool, I'll build that in a weekend. I had to then sit them down and go, okay, name which weekend you're going to build this. How much time are you going to spend on it? How much time is it going to take you to maintain it? All of those things, which don't naturally become conversations. So usually, if you've got a core product, you can get through that pain. You can get through to them and say, actually, there's a pain point here that you should be paying attention to, because most good products, most good companies will solve pain. Like, otherwise, why do they exist, right? And it's just finding how you articulate that pain and where it is and who experiences it, and whether they're champions or salespeople or actually people who are going to buy your product or not.
Awesome.
So there's a whole journey you have to go through there.
Yeah. And so you're now at Timely.
Like Timely have been...
Or not Timely anymore, is it?
Yeah, so Timely is part of EverCommerce, which is a conglomerate of 52 different businesses in the services space. So anybody who sells time for a living should be using one of our products is the aim, from builders, plumbers, handy people, through to, in America, doctors when they're running their studio, their health practices, that's the word I'm looking for, through to our sector, which is the wellness sector. So Timely is in hairdressing, hair and beauty sector. So pretty much we power a lot of the hairdressers and beauty parlors for New Zealand, Australia, and the UK.
Yeah.
We've also got another product called SalonBiz, which is in America. So I run the tech teams for both of those, essentially.
Bigger team now with a global partner.
So
how does that
part
feel?
of a 3,000, no, not quite that, two and a bit thousand person organization in EverCommerce, but I really focus on those two products and around about 50 or so engineers across both of those products, which is great. They all have different quirks and different things that make them amazing, but the people, it's always about the people. So I love working with the people at Timely and SalonBiz and EverCommerce. They're all really genuine people.
They are.
It's just working out how did they operate within a bigger context is always fun.
And so how did that change after Scof left? So Scof was the founding CTO.
Yeah, so I was coaching Scof as an executive coach, and he mentioned that, through coach confidentiality, that he was going to take some money off the table and move on, go and fly planes, or
that's all he does now, apparently.
I'd love to be in that position. So my coaching business, I thought I could I was doing virtual CTO and coaching at the same time. Virtual CTO just wasn't going to work. Everybody wants the CTO for a day a week, but use them for 5 days a week. So, I'd not be on the clock, but I'd be getting the problems from the team, because you're managing an entire team. So it's hard. So kind of February-ish of 21, decided, this isn't for me. Hey, I'd like to put my hat in the ring for that job that you've got going at Timely, and interviewed and took that role with the idea that I would take over from Scof in about August, and then the acquisition was announced in June to me as well. So I didn't have any prior knowledge that was going to happen, and then he moved on. The difference now is we are still run as an entity. Like I get to make decisions day in, day out around how technology is built. Obviously, all of our budgets roll up to a wider organization. So we're driven with we're now at profitable growth rather than growth at all costs. Whereas early startups, you're just spending money to try and grow this engine as fast as you can. We're now trying to grow within that margin of profitability. So, which is fun. It's a different challenge. You're making different decisions than you would have had you gone, okay, I've got 10 million in the bank and I've got to spend it in order to make better returns than a bank would. Here we're kind of trying to grow the whole company EverCommerce wide, and because we're now multinational organizations exposed to lots of different markets. You've got America's going into massive recession. Well, not massive recession, but a recession. And we're not yet there in New Zealand or Australia. Not to say that we won't ever be. It will be. But we've all got to help each other as a wide organization. So.
What's your take on this, right? So there's a lot of companies laying people off at the moment, right? Big tech companies.
Yeah.
What's your take on? Do you think a lot of them just hired too many people?
There's never one answer to that kind of stuff. I certainly there's a different. The companies you're seeing laying off right now are having to react because the market have told them they have to react, right? Like when you look at Facebook or AWS. Or Microsoft, they could probably keep those staff on, but the market will not let them, right? There's a lot of shareholder pressure there. So, US, like it or lump it, shareholder pressure counts for a lot. So they have to make those decisions. There's the other startups that have just hit a brick wall of runway, right? Like the runway is now what you thought was going to be 3 months because you could go and raise another capital round is now being extended out to 18 months. This is essentially what we hit at 8i, right? Like we ran out of runway earlier than we had anticipated because the product wasn't mature enough or the market wasn't mature enough or we weren't going to get the sales we wanted.
And they were paying people lots of money.
So you have to rationalize, right? You have to go, okay, everybody's gone, like literally everybody in this entire company is gone within, 6 months. Or we downsize the company and therefore the company might have a chance of surviving with less people for a wee while until we find where the next stage is. While I don't like the fact that I had to go through letting quite a lot of people go at 8i, it's my last act. I walked out the door after having made our product engineering team pretty much redundant. I'd like to think I did it with good openness and honesty around why. We just were not going to make the numbers and we were never going to survive as a company if we didn't do something drastic. And it was drastic. And right now that's what's happening, right? The funding market is drying up because VCs do not want to invest in the uncertain times. There are still VCs that will invest, but they won't invest in the riskier businesses. Crypto's gone. So, all of those companies no longer have a surefire market to raise the next round, and then everybody's pricing in inflation as well. So your market capitalization is lower. So suddenly your company that was worth, on paper, $1 billion is now worth, a third of that because everybody's banking in years of 7-8% inflation.
Yeah. So I think how long have we been going, Jono?
We started at 9:38.
All right, cool. So we've been going. All right, well, we'll edit this part out, but I'll wrap up with this question here. Okay, so on that then, what would you say to someone who's out there right now with an idea and they're scared it's the wrong time? They're looking at there's no more funding or funding's a lot harder now. What advice would you give to them? I
would say start, if you've got an idea that you need to get done and it works, fundamentally it's something that it's an itch that you really have to scratch. This is the best time to start a startup, right? Xero came out of the GFC. Most of the big names that came out early 2000s actually came out of the dot-com crash. It taught people to be better with money, to have a good runway. If you start a business now, you're going to be forced to have the fundamentals right, and you're going to be focused on the right things. Whereas, when in the era of free money, which was the last decade, so many of those companies were not focused on the right things. They were just like, oh, cool, I can start a business and I can raise lots of money. Let's go for it. I think we'll see some of the best companies coming out of this era because they'll be fundamentally set up with the right foundations.
Yeah.
And that's, you're solving a real core problem. You're doing it effectively and efficiently, and your unit economics work at a certain level. All companies come down to those in the end. So,
yeah, awesome, and get a good mentor.
Yeah,
for that stage. Excellent, man. Hey, well, thanks for joining me today. It's been awesome chatting with you.
Yeah.
I always like to wrap up by asking one question at the end, which is, what makes you happy?
Yeah, it's the most scary question in the world because sometimes I don't know, right? Like I come off as a very happy person, but sometimes, like I can be quite lonely at the top.
Yeah.
Definitely people. Like, I just love having chats and conversations with people and seeing people flourish. So getting to know lots of people, and I like to think I've got some friends,
Yeah, awesome. Well, you definitely come across as a happy guy, and the feedback on you as a recruiter is always, strong. Like you do a lot of work in terms of helping people that you work with, or not just work with. So well done, mate.
Cool.
Awesome, mate. Well, thanks so much for your time today.
Absolute pleasure.
Yeah, let's
no worries.
let you get back out there.
Yeah, thanks.
Cheers, mate. The reason why we started these podcasts is because we wanted to be able to give back to the audience and actually share people's stories. And so I hope Owen's episode really gives a lot of people that understanding around leadership and technology leadership. And he shares a lot of wisdom in that. And so I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Please like and share, and let us know if you want to see someone on the podcast, and subscribe.
This podcast is produced by John Otaka from Empire Films.